Spin. Rumpelstiltskin Retold. A tale in the Romance, a Medieval Fairytale series. Written by Demelza, Carlton. Autonarrated by AI Charlotte from Google. 1. Kempenich winced as he reined in his horse. Even that slight movement set off the pain in his chest. Truth be told, he should not be riding at all, and he knew it. But some things could not wait. The destrier's hooves caught on something, but the horse righted himself before Kempenich was thrown from the saddle. He breathed a sigh of relief. Darkness had carried him into many battles at the order of King Carl the Great, while the monarch had lived. Now he'd outlived his king, the time had come for what might be his last battle, and he intended to ride the black beast home from this one. He slid down to the ground. "I seek the witch," he bellowed. It took every bit of his strength to stand tall and stride toward the cottage, as a knight should. The witch emerged, her arms folded across her chest. There was pity in her dark eyes, but she stood firm. "I am sorry, Sir Rumpelstiltskin, but there is nothing more I can do for you. You're dying." Mistress Coon turned away. Sir Kempenich von Rumpelstiltskin refused to admit defeat. "I may be dying, but there is still something you can do for me." She sighed. "I assure you there is not, but why don't we go inside and discuss it? I can see you need a pain draft. That, at least, I can give you." Kempenich followed her inside the cottage, then sank gratefully onto a bench. He would drink anything she asked, if only she would grant him one last favor. Mistress Coon darted about the cottage, assembling what she needed to make the draft, and Kempenich summoned his resolve. Once more into battle, not for his life but for the future. "Mistress, I have heard tales that you are more than a herb wife and healer. More than a usual witch. There are tales that you are what heathens call an enchantress, a woman who works magic. They say that you have power over earth and rocks, and when a child from the village fell down a well, you cracked open the very earth itself to retrieve her, then commanded the rock to return to its previous place, and it obeyed." Kempenich held his breath, praying she would confirm the story. Coon glanced at him. "There are all sorts of tales. Why, I have heard people tell stories of unicorns and dragons and immortality to children around the fire at night." Kempenich bowed his head. He too had told such tales to his children, including one he hoped was more fact than fiction. There is a story about an ancient king who was granted a wish. He wanted to be the richest man in the world, so he wished for everything he touched to turn to gold. It is said that gold comes from the ground, and a wielder of earth magic might be able to do such a thing. Coon lifted a bucket of water and poured some of it into a small pot over the fire. "Then you must also know the end of the king's tale. He could not eat or drink or touch his family, and he feared his wish would kill him, so he washed his wish away in the river and shunned gold for the rest of his days. I will soon be beyond such mundane things as gold or food or even days, mistress. But my family will not. And I have spent all that I have in physic for what ails me, seeking a cure that will let me live long enough to restore my family's fortune. If I die now, I will leave them little more than the Rumpelstiltskin house on stilts my father left me, on the rock King Carl granted him for his service. Other knights are building castles along the river to secure their lands, and if my son does not have one, he will lose his lands to a richer man who does. He needs gold, and I would give anything to give it to him." Coon sank onto a bench and squinted at him in the dim light. "You ask me to curse you? Not for yourself but for your son, who you will never be able to touch again. You will never be able to eat or drink, and your own wife will not be able to hold your hand as you take your dying breath. You even wish to hasten that dying breath." "Yes. I am no use to them like this. Better to be dead than to be a burden." Kempenich took the cup she offered and drained it. Silence stretched between them. But it was Mistress Coon who broke it. "There is some truth in the tale, but the enchanter who cast such a spell was a fool. I can restrict the spell to your hands while you live. You may still eat and drink, as long as your hands do not touch it. But when your heart stops, the spell will spread throughout your body, turning it all to gold. Kun bowed her head. This I will do for you, but you must swear to tell no one about the source of your wealth. Breathe a word to anyone that I cast the spell, and that breath shall be your last. I swear on my honor and that of my father that I shall tell no one, Kempenich promised. Then hold out your hands, palms up, Kun instructed, picking up a knife. She pricked her thumb with the point, then used the welling blood to trace lines on Kempenich's fingers, then his hands, until she swiped her thumb along the lines on Kempenich's wrists, right the way around. By my blood, I bespell yours. Everything your hands touch from this moment until the day you die will turn to gold. For a moment, Kempenich's hands glowed, then lit up in a blinding flash of blue that made him turn his head away, lest the brightness hurt his eyes. When he saw his hands again, the light had vanished, and so had the blood, though the blue tinge to his fingertips had taken on a greenish hue. Dead hands. Kempenich shivered. Did he dare touch anything with them? What if the spell hadn't worked, and he tainted whatever he touched instead? I would offer you a cup of wine to toast your family's fortunes, but... Kempenich grimaced. No more wine for me now? It does not agree with the draft you gave me. Kun nodded. I have just the thing. One of the dairymaids brought a pail of milk this morning, and it's been chilling in the cellar ever since. I mean to keep the cream for butter, but there will be more tomorrow. She rose and headed for the cellar. When she returned, she carried a brimming jug that she poured into 2 cups and a bowl. When she caught Kempenich eyeing the bowl with curiosity, she shrugged. That's for butter. He usually comes running as soon as I go into the cellar, for he loves his milk. She raised her voice and called, Butter? Puss puss puss. But the cat did not come. With increasing urgency, the witch kept calling, leaving Kempenich alone in the cottage as she moved outside. After a while, Kun fell silent. But she didn't come back in. Kempenich debated whether to follow her or stay and wait. He wanted to head home before the effects of Kun's draft wore off, but even the walk to where he'd tethered darkness wore him out these days. He knew in his bones this would be his last ride. You did this. Kun shrieked, bursting into the cottage. In her arms, she cradled a piece of gold-colored fur. It took a moment for Kempenich to realize the fur was still attached to a feline body. I've never seen that cat before, he said weakly. It wasn't a lie. Too late, he remembered his horse stumbling as he arrived at the cottage. Had darkness lost his footing because he trod on the cat? Kun pointed a shaking hand at darkness. He had a muddy hoofprint on his back that could only have come from that enormous warhorse of yours. You come here for my help, yet you kill my cat without a care? It's not my fault your ailment is beyond my powers. You, Sir Kempenich von Rumpelstiltskin, have no heart, and that is what is killing you. Take your golden curse, but know this, every male born of your blood will bear the same curse. His heart will fail him in his prime just as yours has, and his only warning will be the curse, heralding his death. And you, she waved her hand, and Kempenich found himself soaring through the air to land in the saddle. You shall have a daily reminder of the creature you killed. Another wave of her hand, and a pair of gloves appeared on Kempenich's hands. Golden brown leather, lined with golden fur. Kempenich glanced at her, only to find the cat's corpse had vanished. He now wore it on his hands. His belly roiled, but he fought to keep the biller down. But Kun wasn't finished. As long as you wear these gloves, you may touch things like a normal man. Take them off and all you touch turns to gold. A curse on you and all who follow you. Please. Curse me, kill me, do what you will with me, but don't hurt my son, he begged. Her eyes were the cold of black ice. Bring my cat back to life, and I will consider it. Please? She clapped her hands. Go. The tether holding darkness broke and he galloped off, forcing Kempenich to cling desperately to the reins so that he would not fall off. "And don't return," she shouted after him. As his world dissolved into despair, Kempenich knew one thing for certain: he would never return to the witch's cottage. For if he survived the ride home, it would be a miracle indeed. He remembered little until something in the horse's slowing gait made him open his eyes. After several blinks, the blue-green blur before him revealed itself to be the corroded bronze lion that protected the bridge to the island where the house of Rumpelstiltskin stood. Without thinking, he pulled off his glove and patted the lion's head, as he had done every time he returned home safely. This time his fingers tingled at the touch, and too late he realized what he'd done. The bluish bronze was neither blue nor bronze anymore but bright shining gold. He shoved his hand back into the cat fur glove, cursing witches and their cats. His son would die young, and so would his grandsons, because Kempenich had been a thoughtless fool who sought out a witch. He should have left things well enough alone. But it was too late now. What had he done? And how would he ever set it right? As his vision faded and Kempenich slid from his horse to the ground, fighting for air that did not seem to breathe life into him anymore, he had one last fleeting thought. Even if he died before he could restore his family's fortune, at least his son would have a chance to do it. Before this curse killed him too. 2. And so the wheel turns. The flax would flower and fade, the ponds would fill and flow, and through it all Molina would spin and spin and spin, for how else could a woman help the prosperity of her flood-ravaged town? She stared wistfully at the water wheels, which never stopped as long as the water flowed down from the mountains. If Lord Barkmeyer would only listen to her and let more such wheels be built, their town would be prosperous once more. His grandfather had listened to her grandmother, otherwise these wheels would not be here at all. But to hear the current Lord Barkmeyer talk, it was as though nothing had changed since his many times great-grandfather had been given this land from King Carl the Great himself. If half the stories she'd heard of King Carl, or Charlemagne as the current king called him, were true, he'd have built new wheels all over his empire before the year was out, harnessing the flood instead of complaining about it. At least Lord Barkmeyer had agreed to plant flax in the flood-ravaged fields as soon as the water went down. Which meant an ocean of blue flowers instead of other crops, but they could trade linen for food. Heaven's new precious little grain had passed through the mill this year, but that was just as well, for they needed the spare water wheels to power the hammers to beat the flax. That had been her mother's design, but Molina had improved on it since. What Lord Barkmeyer didn't know wouldn't hurt him. Molina sighed. She could speed up some of the process, but spinning the flax still took the most time. If she could use a wheel to turn the spindle, this would be so much faster. "Good day, Miss Molina," a male voice said. She glanced up in time to see Hofer slap Lanik before Lanik remembered to snatch his cap off his head. "Good day, boys. How goes the spring planting?" "Almost done, miss. But it looks like the flax on the northern slopes is almost ready to harvest, maybe as early as next week. So we might have to bring the flax up to the pools to soak, and my father sent us to make sure there is water enough up there in the mill ponds," Hofer said. "The pools are full, with enough water coming down the mountain to keep the wheels turning," Molina replied. Lanik coughed. "Beg pardon, miss, but Uncle wanted us to speak to Mr. Raidmaker." Of course he did. None of the men in town would take the word of a mere woman over the miller, even if she was his daughter. Molina forced a smile. "Father is beekeeping today. He had his eye on some wild hives further up the mountain, and he thinks they will swarm soon. He means to capture some new queens for our hives. Their hives were the only ones that had survived the flooding, so if Father didn't capture new bees, there would be no mead brewed in the town at all this year. I'm sure he'd appreciate the help of two big strong lads. Maybe even look the other way if a boy managed to get his hands on a honeycomb of his own." "Yes, miss." "Thank you, miss." The boys scampered off, too eager at the thought of the possible sweet treat awaiting them to even say farewell. Boys indeed. They were the same age as she was, old enough to marry, but she'd never see them as anything but the boys she'd grown up with. Certainly not potential husbands, though the other girls in the village didn't seem to share her opinions. Most of them were married already. At this rate she wouldn't marry anyone, and today would be the same as every day for the rest of her life. She would sit and spin and watch the water wheels, waiting for her father to return home for the evening meal, wishing for something different. Today she could do something different. She'd done enough spinning for one day, and the warm breeze whispered of the summer waiting just over the horizon. Perhaps she should go check on the pools herself, and have a swim while she was up there. If the pools would be full of flax next week, this might be her only chance. She set her spinning inside and dug out a cloth she could use to dry herself afterwards. Flinging it over her shoulder, she set off up the mountain, following the stream to the source of all its bubbling secrets. 3. Lubos had changed his mind, he decided. Marriage was indeed the happiest state in the world, for if he were at home with his chosen wife, he would not be here in this predicament. He almost wished he'd simply closed his eyes and agreed to the first girl his father thrust toward him as a possible bride. Instead, he had to endure the company of what felt like hundreds of girls exactly the same as the first. Oh, they might look different, with blonde hair or brown or even a redhead or two, but whatever color their eyes had been, he had not noticed. For every girl's eyes held the same look, wide and on the verge of tears. For each girl had been little more than the object of their father's ambition. He wanted her to marry the prince, therefore she was dangled in front of a prince, and it was her duty to ensnare said prince, or forever dishonor her whole family. He did not want to be a duty. He wanted a wife who wanted him, not merely a crown. Yet it seemed once women knew he was the crown prince, the crown part was all they saw. Lubos had had his fill of such girls at court, which was why he'd happily agreed to his father's suggestion that he accompany the tithe collectors on their rounds this year. Father had told him he suspected a conspiracy among his lords and barons, who were cheating him of his rightful percentage. Lubos, however, smelled a different plot. The recent floods had affected them all, and all of his father's kingdom was poorer because of it. If the tithe was smaller this year, it was because the lords and barons had less to give. Well, to the king perhaps. Every man among them with a daughter old enough to be out of swaddling clothes wanted to push the poor girl toward the prince, and it was worse than court. Lord Barkmeyer was by no means the worst of them, but Lubos had to give him credit for being the most persistent. His 4 daughters were all old enough to be married, and it seemed the girls had a competition among themselves to see who could win the prince. Lord Barkmeyer had boasted about the quality and quantity of linen his lands produced, and it seemed that every lady in the land was employed in making the stuff. His own daughters went everywhere with a spindle in one hand and a distaff in the other, linked by a length of thread. This thread they then used to ensnare him in any way they could. Why, only last night, Lubos had woken from a terrible nightmare. The 4 girls had turned into spiders, venom dripping from their fangs, as they spun webs to entrap him the moment he moved. Unable to bear the feeling of fine wool or linen, for it reminded him of his nightmare, in the morning he dressed in his coarsest clothes. But he'd almost screamed when Lorelei let her hair trail over his hand as she filled his cup. To escape her wide eyes and even wider mouth, for Lorelei had evidently never heard a man utter such an unmanly squeak before, he'd made his excuses and bolted. He headed to the town at first, a place where the girls did not go, for they believed it was beneath them, or at least their father did. But as he descended into the valley, Lubos noticed a stream with a well-worn path beside it, that led up the mountain and into the forest. There might be good hunting up here, he thought, which would give him a good excuse to flee from Lord Barkmeyer and his daughters in the future, if he needed it. As he climbed, Lubos heard a strange creaking sound. Like a sign blown in the wind, but it was not a back-and-forth sound. It was as though the wind had picked up the sign and carried it forward, protesting all the way as it moved ever onward. Lubos laughed aloud at the thought. Why, the sign was him, moving ever onward from vassal to vassal, protesting when presented with a possible bride at each new castle. Lubos emerged from the shelter of the trees and saw the truth. The creaking was driven by water, not wind. Nor did the wood move onward. The giant water wheels, spinning on their axles in the stream's turbulent flow, could go nowhere. They were anchored in this place, as marriage would make him a fixture in his father's castle for the rest of his life. A small bridge arced over the millstream, leading to a building as big as any manor house Lubos had visited on his travels. This belonged to the miller, or at least it did now. Perhaps Lord Barkmire's family had once lived here before moving to their current castle. He considered crossing the bridge so that he might take a closer look at the house, and perhaps obtain a cup of ale, for climbing this path had been thirsty work. But if this house belonged to Lord Barkmire still, then any of his daughters might be lying in wait for him there, or one of his servants who might send a runner to find the girls. Either way, his solitary walk would be over. Instead, Lubos dropped to his knees beside the stream, cupped his hands and drank. It was cold and sweet, tasting of the mountains it had descended from. Better yet, it slaked his thirst enough to make him choose a higher path, the one that led further up the mountain, following the stream. For if the water tasted so good in the lower reaches down here, how much purer would it be in heights? Determined now, he followed the stream to its source. 4. Molina trekked up to the pools, panting a little as the slope grew steeper. The track led to the topmost pool, the biggest and deepest of the three. The cool blue water tempted most newcomers into taking a dip, but Molina knew better. The glacier-fed stream was ice-cold still when it fed the top pool, and the overhanging trees did little to let the sun in to warm the water. The second pool was little better, for it was cut into the cold stone of the mountain itself, which seemed to drink the warmth the water gained from the sun glittering across its surface. The third pool, however, was an overflow for the other two. When the snowmelt was too much for the top two pools to take, the water trickled down over the rocks into what was now a third pool, but after midsummer would be little more than a depression in the ground, where the softest, thickest grass grew. Now it was waist-deep, perfect. No trees grew around this pool. The rocks left them no place to take root. Molina clambered down to the bottom pool before she stripped off, laying her clothes out on the rocks. She was under no illusions that the water would be warm, and she would appreciate her sun-warmed clothes when she donned them again. She stretched her towel out on the biggest, flattest rock, where it would be within easy reach. From up here, you could see almost clear to the other side of the valley and all the town in between. If anyone approached, she would spot them at least a mile away as they took the road leading out of town, more than enough time to dry off and dress. So she plunged into the water, hissing at that first cold contact, before she grew used to the temperature and began to wash. She used the soap on her body first, lathering and rinsing as she surveyed the valley below. Then, checking that she could still feel her feet, she decided to take advantage of the afternoon sun to wash and dry her hair too. Unbinding it took some time and washing it even longer, for the thick dark mane was her only vanity, not that anyone noticed. Most of the other girls in the village had hair in varying shades of flax. The darkness that made her different didn't appeal to any of the village boys. Not that she wanted it to, Molina reminded herself. When she was satisfied that her hair was hidden under the thick layer of creamy lather, she lay back, floating on the surface of the water as she rinsed the soap from her hair. She combed her fingers through it again and again, sending bubbles over the lip of the little waterfall, which in turn fed the stream that turned her father's water wheels. She squinted at the turning wheels, which looked like toys from this distance. If she could only attach a spindle to the axle of one and yet keep the distaff close enough. Molina shook her head and ducked under the water. Under the surface, the world was murky and green, much like the strange ideas that wanted to take shape in her head. Watermills for spinning and weaving. Why, even Lord Barkmire thought her daft, having such ideas. Perhaps he was right. No, she was not daft, she told herself firmly, surging out of the water. Her father listened to her, just as he had listened to her mother. Her ideas were new and different, much like mother's, and the town did not like different. The floods had proved that. The floodwaters might have washed away crops and buildings, but it seemed the swirling waters had taken some people's sanity with it too. Once things settled down again, perhaps then they would be open to new ideas. Lord Barkmeyer could not live forever. She used her towel to dry herself off as best she could and squeezed the water from her hair. She pulled on a shift to cover her nakedness, then began to comb her hair. When the tangles were gone, she stretched out on the rock where her towel had lay, letting the sun dry her hair, before she braided it back into a style more suitable for a virtuous miller's daughter. Resting her head in her hand, once again she watched the water wheels turning, the cogs of her mind turning with them. A spindle, a distaff, and a wheel, all placed together so that she had no need to hold them, leaving her hands free to spin and spin faster. She found a fire pit, long since extinguished, where the farmhands heated up their dinner on flax harvest days, and dug out some charcoal. A piece of bark, caught between two rocks on the edge of the pool, sufficed as her canvas, and Molina began to draw the design taking shape in her head. 5. A rabbit hopped across the path, and Lubos found himself reaching for his bow out of habit. By the time he knocked an arrow to the string though, the creature had vanished. It was for the best, he mused, for he was not truly on the road between castles at the moment. If he were, the rabbit would be a welcome addition to the evening stew pot, but if he brought it back to Lord Barkmeyer's kitchen, it would surely be wasted, for the man kept a fine table already. Just looking at his 4 plump daughters could have told Lubos that. There must be something wrong with him, that such examples of beautiful womanhood did nothing for his libido. But his father's vassals were determined to get a betrothal out of him, so he returned home with a bride. Another rabbit hopped past, slower this time. Lubos pulled out his bow and managed to fire before the creature disappeared, but all he hit was grass. He cursed. Unlucky in love and unlucky in hunting. He could do little to improve the first, but the second was within his power. Lubos emptied his quiver, setting the arrow's point first into the ground at his feet. He surveyed his surroundings and settled on a tree 50 yards away to be his target. Lubos let the first arrow fly, followed by the rest, before going to retrieve them and try again. He hit the tree more times than he missed, but he could improve. He could. He fired arrow after arrow all afternoon, until his arms ached and his sweat-drenched tunic stuck to him in the unseasonable spring heat. His desire to find the stream's source redoubled, and he packed away his bow and arrows so that he might take the mountain track higher still. A trickling waterfall seemed to be the source of the stream's flow, and he stopped to cup his hands beneath it. He brought the water to his lips and drank. But instead of the pure sweet water he'd tasted in the lower reaches, this had the distinct taint of something like soap. Lubos spat it out and wiped his mouth. Had he climbed the mountain in search of pure water, only to find a washerwoman at work? Even now, luck eluded him. He would have to climb higher to find what he sought. The path curved away from the waterfall, and Lubos took it. He rounded a particularly large boulder and found himself in a positively enchanted clearing, where dappled sunlight filtering through the trees glittered on the surface of a deep pool. A pool with no sign of washerwomen or their work. Lubos edged closer until he was near enough to cup his hands and drink. The freezing water numbed his hands, but it tasted so fresh he had to drink more. A sound from below drew his attention, and he peered down the slope. He'd thought there was only one pool when there were actually 3. The lowest pool had clothes laid out on the rocks to dry, but there was no one in sight. Perhaps the washerwoman would return? Lubos paused for a moment. Reaching the 3rd pool would require climbing down rocks. He'd do it, and he could see adventurous youngsters doing it, but a weary wife, burdened with a bag of laundry? He hadn't met a woman yet who wanted to make her work harder. So he climbed down, determined to satisfy his curiosity, even if he had to wait all day for the washerwoman's return. Either the clothing belonged to a remarkable woman indeed, or there was an easier path he couldn't see from up here. "Where did you come from?" an imperious voice demanded. Lubos lost his grip and slid down the last few yards. Thankfully, he managed to land mostly on his feet before he whirled to face his interrogator. For a moment, he didn't even see her until he looked down. One of the creamy underdresses was occupied. The girl sat up and folded her arms across her breasts. A good thing too, for the fine linen showed more of them than was decent. "How did you get here?" she demanded. Lubos had to open and close his mouth several times before his voice came out. From the road from the castle. Lord. He couldn't for the life of him remember the man's name, and the more he stared at the girl's dark hair blowing free in the breeze, the less he could think of anything but her. "You came from Lord Barkmire's castle? One of his new labourers, I imagine, as you can't even remember his name. Did he send you with a message for the miller? I'll take it, but next time you should go straight to the house. No one is to touch the mill ponds without the miller's permission." Lubos stared at her outstretched hand, trying to work out what she wanted him to place in her palm. "Did Lord Barkmire send you?" she repeated. He fixed his gaze on her gown stretched out on a rock. It was as fine as those worn by any of Barkmire's daughters, though she didn't look anything like them. Her hard curves were half the size of their soft ones, and her dark hair and eyes were midnight to the daughter's cloudy morning light. Exotic. Irresistible. Like no woman he'd ever seen before. And wearing nothing but a shift, as if she wanted to tempt him. "He must have known I would come here. Made sure you were waiting for me. I must say, if you are the woman he had in mind to warm my bed, Lord Barkmire's hospitality has definitely improved beyond measure," Lubos said, taking a step toward her. She was nimbler than he expected, leaping to her feet. In 3 strides, she was close enough to snatch up her gown and use it to cover her shift. "The only bed or warm is my own, and Barkmire knows that well," she said with a dangerous glint in her eye. "If he sent you to make trouble for me, then he must truly hate you. A man with no honor, who has not even the courtesy to turn his back when he stumbles across a woman in a state of undress. Perhaps this is the first time I will share Barkmire's opinion." A washerwoman with a fine gown, so close to the manor house by the mill, this was the miller's wife. And he just treated her like a common harlot. Feeling his face grow hot, Lubos bowed low. "Forgive me, Mistress Miller. I was struck dumb by your beauty." He kept his eyes firmly on the ground at his feet. "Dumb means you cannot talk. You may have a problem with your tongue, but that is not it," she said gently. "You are new here, so I will forgive you this once, farm boy, as long as you do not say such things again." "Farm boy?" Lubos almost laughed, then realized she had based her assessment on his clothes. If he told her who he truly was, then she would be less forgiving, for a prince should know better. "Thank you, mistress," he said. He waited but received no response. Finally, he lifted his head, only to find the girl had gone. She dressed and disappeared, leaving nothing behind. Something blew from behind him, and he reached out instinctively to catch it. It was a piece of bark, bleached in the sun until it was as pale as parchment. But it wasn't the bark that held his attention. It was the sketch on it. A few lines, scrawled in charcoal, but he could clearly make out the shape of the water wheels below, connected to what looked like a spindle and distaff. Her work it must be. Tucking the piece of bark inside his tunic, he began to make his way back to Barkmire's castle. But he saw nothing of the road, no matter how many rabbits hopped across his path. All his vision was occupied by a pair of glittering dark eyes that belonged to the miller's wife. 6. Her father was jubilant about getting 3 new queens for the hives, and Helga had made a particularly fine stew with dumplings before heading back to the village for the evening, so Molina did her best to forget the strange encounter with Lord Barkmire's new farmhand. For a moment there, she thought Barkmire had sent the boy to kidnap her and force her to become his bride. But Barkmire wouldn't do such a thing, surely. He'd asked, she'd refused, and he'd insisted she would regret her decision when he chose another. He'd said it dismissively, as though he cared little what she regretted, for he would have shifted his affections elsewhere if indeed they existed at all. The village boys still fear you. What in heaven's name did you do to scare them so? Father asked. Molina considered her response carefully before she said, "Oh, they think I'm a witch, because I know how the water wheels work." Actually, it was more likely they blamed her for that Easter festival when she and a few of the other people her age had drunk too much wine and decided to celebrate some ancient pagan fertility festival that Rickard insisted was celebrated at the same time. They'd all paired up, taken their clothes off, and proceeded to see how fertile they were. 2 of the girls fell pregnant that night, but when Rickard entered Molina, she'd cried out so loudly at the pain that she'd killed his desire too. He claimed she'd cursed his manhood with her barrenness, and as she was the only girl not carrying a child, the others believed it. But she had no intention of telling her father that. Barkmeyer won't wait forever. A lord like him will lose patience eventually and decide to take what he wants. You should choose a husband and marry the man soon. Then Barkmeyer will turn his eyes elsewhere. Molina shrugged. None of the village men are a better choice than Barkmeyer, for if they were, I'd be married already. My passion is for water wheels and what we can make with them. Machines, not men. That's what your mother said too. Did you know the first time I kissed her, it was behind the mill? And one day when we went swimming in the mill pond together. I know, you've already told me, Molina interrupted, not wanting to hear about the first time her parents got naked together. It reminded her too much of the disturbing events of the afternoon. Does Barkmeyer have some new workers up at his farm? Father frowned. Not that I've heard. Plenty of boys here in the village who would jump at the job, for Barkmeyer offers married quarters for the men who work for him. Better than sharing a house here in the village with several generations of your family, or so they say. He brightened. But the king's tithe collectors are on their way. They've been to the other provinces and we're bound to be next. If you have your heart set on a man not from the village, one of the king's men might be your best chance. Especially if he takes you back to the capital. Barkmeyer might not listen when we tell him what our water wheels can do, but I'm sure the king will care. I'm not seducing one of the king's soldiers, Molina objected. How about one of the king's knights? Or a nobleman from court? The tithe is the most valuable thing in the countryside, and he sends his best knights to protect it. Have you ever seen a man in armor? Molina considered for a moment. No, but I can't see how armor is meant to be attractive. I mean, you cannot see his face under the helmet, and what if you cut yourself on the metal trying to undress him? Marrying a knight sounds like a good way to get hurt. Father shook his head. Once again with all the thinking. Your mind never stops. Your mother would be so proud, but she'd be telling you even louder that village life will never be enough for you. It was for her. Father smiled sadly. She stayed for me and because she got to build the water wheels the way she wanted them. Without a new project or someone to love, she would never have stayed. The water wheels are as good as they will get, yet I know you have ideas almost daily. Tell me what you thought of today. Father knew her too well. Molina relented. Today I got sick of spinning, so I designed a machine that holds the spindle and the distaff and turns the spindle with a wheel. You could attach it with gears to a water wheel so it spins at just the right rate. Father laughed. Show me. Molina felt in her bodice, where she usually stashed her sketches but found none. Damn! I must have left it up by the pools. A man came and distracted me, so I came home earlier than I intended. I'll go up there tomorrow to retrieve it, so I can show you. I really think this will work. I would have to build it and try it first, but I think this can easily halve the time I spend spinning. It all depends on the speed. If Barkmeyer agreed to let you try half the things you think up, no one in the village would have to work at all. He's a fool for not listening to you. His only redeeming feature is his good taste in wine. And women, for he did choose you over the other girls in the village. Father poured himself a cup of wine and leaned back on his bench until his head touched the wall. If you were younger, I'd tell you one of those fairy tales, where a knight in shining armor comes to woo the lovely young miller's daughter, carrying her away on his horse. For all that I wish there was such a man for you, even I doubt it in this day and age. All the modern knights seek fame and glory in tourneys or crusades, not love. Yet I wish it for you with all my heart. Molina forced herself to smile, for her father's words reminded her of the loneliness that made her heart ache at night. I have you and your love, father. I am lucky to have the love of one wonderful man. To have the love of two seems to be asking too much of fate. Perhaps we should not tempt her so. Father leaned forward. Or perhaps that is exactly what we must do. Tempt fate so that she might change something to make your life more interesting. Maybe not a knight. Maybe a man with rank equal to Barkmeyer, who will treat you as you deserve and listen to your schemes. You know, the ancient goddess of fate here was a spinner. Your new spinning wheel might be just the thing to get her attention. Tomorrow you must find that sketch and tell me everything, for we will build it together. Molina's heart lifted. It had been a long time since her father helped her with a project. Thank you, father. That sounds perfect. 7. Dinner with Lord Barkmeyer and his daughters didn't fill Lubos with dread as it had yesterday. He barely noticed when the girls brushed against him, though he could not deny his relief when Barkmeyer sent his pouting daughters to bed. When Lubos rose to retire, Barkmeyer held up his hand. Please let me share some of my best vintage with you, Your Highness. Such fine wine is not fit for women but for the likes of us, who can appreciate such things. Lubos wondered whether the miller's wife liked wine, fine or otherwise. Perhaps he could send her a cask of the stuff on the morrow, to make up for his rudeness today. He suspected it would need to be a very rare vintage indeed to gain her good opinion, if she even liked wine. Did you enjoy your day, Your Highness? Lord Barkmeyer asked, pouring the wine into 2 goblets. Yes, Lubos said absently. I have heard much about the watermills here, and I wanted to see them for myself. It was a lie, but one that made the other man preen with pride. They were built by one of my great-uncles who saw such things on his travels, Lord Barkmeyer boasted. A younger son, so he had no hope of inheriting the castle. He traveled widely and brought home a wife from foreign parts. Eventually, he made a home for himself and his descendants in the old manor house beside what is now the mill stream. Lubos cursed himself. That made the miller's wife the highest woman in Barkmeyer's lands, second only to Barkmeyer's lady if she'd still lived. Probably nobly born, judging by her clothes. Trust him to insult her. He glanced up to find Lord Barkmeyer staring at him as if waiting for a response. I'm sorry, it has been a long day. Could you repeat that? Lord Barkmeyer didn't seem to be offended, though perhaps his near-empty wine cup had something to do with that. I asked if you met the miller. Raidmaker is a good man. 'Twas his idea to plant flax when all our autumn-sown crops washed away. We have the finest linen anywhere, and now there will be even more of it. No, I did not. I will return on the morrow to see him. And her. Lubos prayed he would not make a fool of himself again. He pulled the bark out of his tunic and held it out. Perhaps you can tell me something. Is this contraption the secret of your linen production? Lord Barkmeyer squinted at the crude drawing, his lip curling in disgust. Our women will not sit idle while a machine does their work. That girl is delusional to think otherwise. Not a week passes that she does not come up here, nagging me about how her inventions could make this province rich if I only surrendered to one of her insane plans. She'd be better served settling down and birthing children for her husband, like the other women in the village. Raidmaker will not live forever, and we cannot be without a miller." He threw the bark down on the table and poured himself another cup of wine. "Drink up, man." Lubos took the cup in one hand, reclaiming the bark with the other. As he sipped the wine, his mind whirled. The miller was an old man, with a young wife. As the miller's wife, he had no business thinking of her, but once she was the man's widow. A less honorable man would help matters along, but Lubos would not stoop to murder, even over a beautiful woman. A woman who claimed she could create wealth with her wheeled contraptions. Lubos would return to the mill on the morrow and ask the girl herself. Perhaps Lord Barkmeyer was right and she was not right in the head, but Lubos doubted it. He'd never looked into a more lucid pair of eyes than hers. "What is the mad woman's name?" Lubos asked casually. "Molina," Lord Barkmeyer muttered. "Bane of my life, Molina. Wouldn't marry me when my wife died either." So she'd chosen the miller over being Lady Barkmeyer. Lubos really did need to meet the miller. On the morrow he promised himself. "To women, though they may drive us mad," Lubos announced, lifting his cup in a toast. Lord Barkmeyer filled and lifted his own. "To good women," he said. Both men drank, their thoughts on the same woman. But only Lubos wore a smile. 8. "I'm going to have a son," Major said proudly. "I visited Dahlia, the witch woman in the woods today. She is a seer, you know, and she is certain the baby will be a boy. You will be a father, Abraham." Chase clapped Abraham on the back. "Congratulations." But Abraham felt no joy in the news. Being born a boy in his family was a death sentence. He knew, for his time had already started to drip away. Without a word, he rose from his seat and left the hall. The spring air still held winter's chill as its icy breath swirled around him in the dark. No breeze could ever be as cold or dark as the invisible hand clenched around his heart, as he stood on the battlements, and wished he dared throw himself off them into the river below. But he could not. Death would find him soon enough, and hastening it would not save his son. "Now you've done it. My sister won't stop sobbing that her husband no longer loves her. First you won't touch her, and now this. What man isn't happy to know he'll have a son and heir?" Chase demanded, emerging out of the dark. "I gave her my word I would call you out if it's true, for it's my duty as your friend and your brother-in-law to beat some sense into you." "Do you believe in magic?" Abraham asked. Chase laughed. "You mean, do I believe the witch? Maybe. I do not know. What does it matter? My sister knows she is carrying a baby and that it is yours, which is good enough for me. You should be celebrating." He shoved a cup at Abraham, but Abraham didn't take it. "Suit yourself then. I shall drink to your good fortune." Chase drank it down in 3 gulps. "I don't mean her. Have you heard the stories about where my family got the lion at the gate?" Abraham pointed at the statue on the bridge below. Even from up here he could see it shine in the torchlight. Chase shrugged. "It looks ancient, like it was taken as a trophy when one of your ancestors conquered some city or other. I mean, who would make something so big in bronze anymore?" "It's not bronze. It's solid gold," Abraham said. "When Kempenich the Curse touched it, he called down a curse on every male in our bloodline. Or so my father told me. I didn't believe him, not even on his deathbed, when he made me swear to find some way to break the curse, but now—" "Some curse. You have a bigger castle than any lord in the land, and more wealth than you know what to do with. A solid gold statue that guards your gate. Why, that sounds like the kind of curse I would beg for, not break." Chase laughed. "Give me the cup," Abraham commanded. "Now you want wine." "Good thing I brought a whole jug," Chase said. He refilled his cup and handed it to his brother-in-law. Abraham took the cup, then tugged off one glove with his teeth and wrapped his bare hand around the clay cup. He lifted it to his lips and drank, wishing he could drown his dread. But Chase needed to know, for someone would have to take care of Major and the baby when he was gone. When the cup was dry, Abraham threw it down on the flagstones at his feet. Instead of the tinkle of broken ceramic, the cup merely clanged and rolled away. "What in heaven's name?" Chase began. Abraham replaced his glove. "Pick it up. It'll be gold, like the statue now. Like anything I touch without the gloves." Chase whistled. "Everything you touch turns to gold? No wonder your family is so rich. Here, do my dagger." He unsheathed the knife and held it out. "A gold dagger is too soft to be any use. Put it away. It's a curse. My family's curse." "It does not sound like such a curse to me." Abraham sighed. "If you could not touch the woman you love without gloves on, you would understand." Realization dawned in Chase's eyes. "So that's why, Major. Why didn't you just tell her?" "Because there's more. The curse only comes when the men of House Rumpelstiltskin are close to death. None of the men in my family have lived for more than a year once they have the touch." Chase looked stricken. "How long? Will you live to see the babe born?" Abraham shook his head. "That's just it. I don't know. I just woke up one morning, reached for the door of the garderobe, and the handle turned cold under my hand. If I touched Major instead..." He shivered. "I haven't taken my gloves off since. My father gave them to me on his deathbed, and told me I would know when to use them. As it turns out, they're the only thing I can touch that doesn't turn to gold. They must be magic too." Silence reigned on the battlements, but for the burble of the river, far below. Chase broke it. "You need to tell her." Abraham laughed bitterly. "Tell her what? That she married a man whose family is cursed? That I'll never be able to touch her again for the rest of my short life, and even worse, our son will suffer the same fate? I didn't believe it, not even when my father told me on his deathbed. I was a child, and thought he was telling me some fairy tale about a man and a witch and a lion. Not until I saw what I'd done to the garderobe door did I think there was any truth in his tale." He buried his head in his hands. "If I'd known, I would never have courted Major. Never married her, never lain with her, for to visit this fate on a child, our child. I deserve my fate. And I do not have enough days to make it up to her. I will die unforgiven. My sister loves you, and even if she had known, I'm not sure even I could have stopped her from marrying you. And I've seen the way you look at her. I know you would never seek to hurt her. You're an honorable man, Abraham. When you vow to do something, you do everything within your power to make sure it happens. You will not die in dishonor. Fulfill the vow you made to your father, and break the curse. For your father, for Major, for your unborn son, for the future of your family." Abraham didn't deserve the blind faith in Chase's eyes. And yet, more than anything, he wanted to believe his brother-in-law's words. Slowly, Abraham nodded. "Though my time is short, I solemnly vow with you as my witness, that I shall spend every waking moment I have left working to break Kempenek's curse, so that my son will be free." Chase leaned over to retrieve the golden cup Abraham had dropped. "I'll hold you to it, my friend. And I'll keep this as a souvenir. I always did want to drink out of a golden cup." Abraham reached out to cuff his friend but drew his hand back. Until he died or broke the curse, he would have to be careful of everyone and everything he touched. Just in case. For now, more than ever, Abraham believed in magic. He would visit the witch on the morrow, so that the seer might tell him his future. And he would not leave until she told him a tale with light at the end, not merely gold and death. 9. Find the wealth the barons are hiding in the countryside, his father had told him. Find it and bring it home. The words became a litany in Lubos' head as he headed back to the mill. Barkmeyer wasn't so much hiding Molina as keeping her to himself and squandering her talents besides. If she truly could create things that would make the kingdom wealthy, make women's work go faster. Just as men looked up to their king, a kingdom's women looked to their queen. They would do their best to fashion clothing like hers, name their children after her, attend royal events just to get a glimpse of her, and maybe receive her blessing. Even his mother, who'd done little more than smile wanly as the constant pregnancies and miscarriages took their toll. Yet away from her could make a crowd erupt in louder cheers than those for his father. He'd heard tales of the legendary Queen Margarita of Aros, who ruled beside her husband as his equal. The story said men willingly laid down their lives for her, for it was an honor to serve such a lady. It was even said that she was responsible for turning her kingdom into a great sea empire, though that could be because her dowry came with Beacon Isle. But even Lubos had heard of Beacon Isle, an independent island that was the greatest trading port in the Northern Sea, occupied by people who called no man king. But they answered to Queen Margarita. If Lubos returned to his father with a wife as formidable as Queen Margarita, a woman who could hold her own against her liege lord and make the kingdom prosper again, well, his father would be pleased. He'd finally leave off trying to make Lubos marry some soft, insipid girl, and Lubos would be free to live the life he dreamed about. Well, last night he dreamed about it, or more specifically her. Dreamed of helping Molina out of that thin shift, so he could see her in all her naked glory before making love to her as a queen deserved. Please let the miller be so old and decrepit he was ready to knock on death's door, Lubos prayed as strode up the path to the mill. What had the man's name been? Raidmaker. A good man. Lubos prayed the man would soon receive his reward in heaven. You must be one of the king's tax collectors, come to inspect the mill. I had begun to think Lord Barkmeyer had forgotten to mention it to you. Lubos looked up to meet the eyes of a man who looked younger than Barkmeyer, or even his own father. A man whose fine linen clothes marked him as more than a farmhand. The man held out his hand. I'm Raidmaker, and I welcome you to our town. We have a particularly fine watermill, thanks to my very talented wife. Lubos' heart sank right down into his boots. Raidmaker was a man in his prime, perhaps 40 years old at most, with only a slight graying at his temples to show he was no longer a young man. Yet Lubos summoned a smile, for it was not Raidmaker's fault he was the luckiest man in the world. I would love to see the watermill. I came yesterday but I was not at home. The wild bees were swarming and I wanted to catch some new queens for our hive. They produce better honey up here on the slopes than in the lowlands of the valley, and Lord Barkmeyer is particularly partial to it. Before the floods, he was often willing to trade a flagon of his best imported wine for my honey, but now that my hives were the only ones to survive the floods, I must increase production to meet the demand. And maybe even the price too. Raidmaker winked. I fancy my honey is never part of the tithe Lord Barkmeyer sends to the king, but I will happily make a gift of it for his majesty. If you promise to make sure the king receives it, I shall give you some for yourself too. Lubos mumbled his thanks, forcing a smile at the thought of such sticky sweetness. He was not overly fond of honey, preferring sharp spices to season his food. Nor was he fond of wine, for the alcohol dulled his wits. It did put him in mind of the gift he'd brought though. I brought a gift for you too, Master Raidmaker. Lord Barkmeyer's best imported wine, I believe. He held out the flagon. Raidmaker laughed. Ah, I see why the king sent out a clever man like you. You have come to uncover all the Lord's secrets. I will share ours freely, for it was my wife's dearest wish to see such watermills all over the country. I hope you will take a good account of us back to the king. How was Lubos to tell the man it was his wife he wanted to take to the king, not tales of watermills? Lubos forced down his raging jealousy and said, Show me and we shall see. Raidmaker ambled up the hill with Lubos, pointing out the pools that fed the mill stream and detailing the output of the mill itself. Lubos learned that the watermills did not just grind grain. They were used to process the flax that made the region's fine linen. Barkmeyer had lied, or he did not know of it. Perhaps Molina had made the modifications to the mill without her lord's knowledge or permission. Lubos wouldn't put it past her. Lubos looked over the water wheels, turning swiftly in the current. All but one that seemed more sluggish than the rest. "What's wrong with that one?" he asked. Raidmaker shrugged. "I don't know. It was fine yesterday, but something must have happened overnight to slow it down. Let's see, shall we?" He led the way up to the slow wheel. "What ails it?" he called. A dark figure emerged from the other side of the wheel. Lubos' breath caught in his throat. Molina stood thigh-deep in the water, her skirt curled up so as not to get wet. "There's something stuck in it," she said, peering between the paddles. "I can almost there." She dived through the paddles, into the middle of the spinning water wheel. "No!" Lubos shouted, leaping into the water to save her. He was soaked in an instant, but he did not care. He wrapped his arms around her waist and dragged her away from the wheel that wanted to crush her. Too late he realized that she wore nothing beneath her skirts, and her pale buttocks pressed against his groin woke up his libido in the most painful way. Then something slapped him in the face, harder than any woman should be able to, and the girl wrenched out of his grasp. Stunned, Lubos shook his head, trying to clear it. "Get out of the water before you freeze to death, you fool," she ordered. "Go before I release the wheel and it wets you even more." Lubos blinked. She'd somehow stopped the water wheel. She hadn't been in danger at all. Fool that he was, he'd grabbed her, and now the iciest water in the world wouldn't return the blood that flooded his nether regions back to his head, so he could think. Think about anything else but cupping that bottom in his hands as he made love to her. "Suit yourself then." Lubos didn't have time to register her words before a wave of water hit him, knocking him on his ass in the stream as the wave washed over his head. He came up spluttering. Near drowning had cooled his ardor somewhat by the time he managed to struggle ashore. Molina stood beside her father, her skirts let down to cover her lovely legs once more as she folded her arms across her breasts. "You'd best come up to the house, Master Lubos. Molina will find you some dry clothes while we dry yours, and it seems only fitting that you stay for dinner." "We're having trout," Molina said, dropping to her knees on the grass. Lubos got another peek under her skirts as she leaned forward to slash her knife across the fat fish's throat before she rose, lifting the fish by the gills. The fish had slapped him, not Molina, Lubos realized, touching his cheek. "Quite a chivalrous creature, even if it is a fish," Molina added, as if reading his mind. Red-faced, Lubos followed her into the house. 10. The witch had hair fluffier than a fresh-shorn fleece. Abraham prayed that her thoughts were not as woolly-headed as she appeared. "Ah, 'tis the boy's father come to call. And not to ask about the baby or the chest pains, though I have prepared a draught for you all the same." The woman smiled and gestured toward the table outside her cottage, and the steaming cup that sat beside a suspicious-looking, smoke-colored cat. Abraham had no intention of drinking some witch's potion. Her talk of chest pains made his ribs ache, though he was certain there had been no pain before. "I did not curse you. It was another witch, long ago, who cursed your ancestor, but I promise you, the chest pains started when you turned that garderobe handle to gold. You just did not notice until now. And the draught is not poisoned. It will ease the pain so that you no longer notice it, at least for a little while." "Do you read minds?" he asked. She laughed softly. "No, Sir Abraham, I do not see into your mind. Instead, I see into the future of what will be, or what it might be. But you do not wish to ask me what will be, for you already know your fate." His voice came out in a whisper. "Less than a year from now the curse will consume me completely and I will die, and my legacy will be to pass the curse on to the very son my wife is carrying, so that in his turn, the curse will consume him too." Her eyes were unusually hard in such a soft face, but they arrowed into his soul. "So tell me, Sir Abraham, if you know the future is so certain, why have you come here? What can you possibly want to ask of me?" It was on the tip of his tongue to say that such a strong seer would surely know the words before they left his lips, but as he gazed into her knowing eyes, the urge left him. To let her speak for him was to let fate have her way with his life, and he would surrender to fate no longer. "I have come to ask how to change my fate. To break the curse that kills my family, for a crime so far in the past none of us can remember it. A way to save my son and fulfill the oath I made to my father." "Save the boy or save yourself?" she asked sharply. Abraham did not flinch from her gaze. "Both of us, if I can. But if I can save the boy from sharing my father's fate, it will be enough." "Would you give your life to do it?" For a long moment, Abraham could not answer. Finally he said, "All men die. If I do nothing, my time is already short." She nodded slowly, as if this answer seemed to satisfy her. "Drink the draught, Sir Abraham." He reached for the cup, clenching his gloved hand around it, and downed the contents. Heat seared his throat, bringing tears to his eyes as he coughed, and now his chest hurt. But it was a small pain, too small to mention. He slammed the cup back on the table. "Satisfied?" he growled. "It is not my good opinion that matters, brave knight, but a girl who you have yet to meet." The witch closed her eyes. "You must go to the capital, and as you cross the bridge into the city, look up. You will see a tower, and there you will find the girl. She will be in danger, though she may not know it yet. You must keep her alive, no matter what happens, in order for her to break the curse. She must break it willingly of her own free choice, even though she does not know how to do it. She is your only hope, and if she dies, then all hope is lost." "Does this girl have a name?" The witch shook her head. "I cannot control the visions, Sir Abraham, nor can I know everything. You have a time and a place to be, and the certainty that she is the right person. I cannot tell you more than I can see." Despair welled up in his breast, threatening to swallow his heart. "But I must know more. Must I leave now, or can I say farewell to my family? Will she break the curse right away, or will I have to wait? Will she do it in time to save me, or save him? What if—" There was pity in her eyes now. "You will leave on the morrow, and you will have time to say farewell to your wife tonight. Once you arrive in the capital, your fate, and that of your son, will be in your hands. When and how and who are questions I cannot answer, for they depend on what lies in your heart, and what you choose to do. One thing I can promise you. If you choose to stay and do not travel to the capital, then both you and your son will die, exactly as you have foretold, and you will die an oathbreaker." "I will not die an oathbreaker." She smiled. "Then perhaps your son will live to hold his own son in his arms. Oh, and one more thing. I cannot tell you more, but I can give you a gift that may make your task easier. They were a gift to me, and heaven knows I have no use for them." She headed into the cottage, then returned a moment later with a pair of extraordinary shoes. They were made of black leather so dark, they seemed to drink the light. They were not new, for dust scuffed the toes, but they seemed hardly worn at all. "Keep them," Abraham said, waving her gift away. "I have no need for another man's cast-off shoes. My family's curse has the fortunate result of keeping us wealthy enough to afford good boots." "Ah, but can your good boots do this?" she asked, slipping the shoes on her own small feet. She stamped her foot 3 times. A hole appeared at her feet, small at first, then widening until it was large enough to swallow her. The witch grinned, then stepped forward. She dropped through the hole, which closed abruptly behind her. Abraham's mouth dropped open and he could not seem to close it. He scuffed his foot across the ground where the hole had opened, but it felt perfectly solid to him, as if the hole had never been. The witch's breathy laugh came from behind him, and Abraham whirled to find her standing in the doorway to the cottage with her arms folded across her chest. "My cellar is beneath you, Sir Abraham. Or more specifically, my bags of flour for baking. I landed on the sacks and came up the stairs to where I am now. Such is the magic of the shoes. Merely stamp your foot thrice while wearing them, touch your toe to the point where you want the hole to form, and it shall open. It works on walls as well as floors. It will close when you have passed through it, just as you have seen." She held out the shoes. In all the best tales, a knight on a quest receives a magical item to help him. Make the tale a good one, Sir Abraham. One that will be remembered through all the ages, so that 1,000 years from now, when the nights are long and dark, someone will start to tell the tale of the man from House Rumpelstiltskin and how he saved a princess from a terrible fate. Abraham bowed. "I thank you for your gifts and your sound advice, Mistress Witch, and I will do everything within my power to be the hero of such a tale." He mounted his horse, waved farewell, and headed home. Dahlia shook her head and reached out to stroke the cat on the table. Should I have told him that when his tale is told, there are those who will think he is the villain, and not the hero, Kisser? "Emro," said Kisser, angling her head to give the witch better access to her neck. Dahlia sighed. "Better that he does not know then. The people of the future must make up their own minds, as he will when the time comes for him to choose." 11. Lubos stripped off his wet clothes, shivering in front of the fire. As if his dreams from last night weren't bad enough, now he'd have visions of what she really looked like under her dress. Even the memory of her pressed against him had him hard as rock all over again. There was only one way to deal with this, short of betting the girl herself, which he knew would never happen. Not now. He'd made an idiot of himself twice in front of her. He found a chamber pot under the dresser and wrapped his hands around himself. As if in answer to his prayer, he spotted a bark sketch on the dresser, capturing in a few lines the beauty of the woman in his head. Dark hair, dark eyes, the swell of her breast beneath her gown. He stroked and stroked, never taking his eyes from her, until finally he groaned, "Oh my God, Molina," as he experienced that glorious release. A breath huffed out behind him. "I'm not sure whether to be appalled or appreciative. Did you just pleasure yourself in front of my mother's picture?" Lubos covered himself with his hands, unable to hide his flaming cheeks. Now he truly was struck dumb. Molina stepped through the doorway, carrying a pile of clothing that she thrust at him. "You're bigger than the boys in the village. Is it because you're better fed as the king's tax collector, or is it a tribute to your desire for my mother?" "I thought the picture was you," Lubos managed to say, then instantly regretted it. Her lips twitched in what might have been a fleeting smile before her frown returned. "First watching me bathe yesterday, now pleasuring yourself in front of my picture. Most men would call you crazy, Master Lubos. Especially when you're staying at the castle with Lord Barkmeyer's 4 beautiful daughters, willing to do almost anything to catch a husband. I'm surprised he let you leave the castle confines, if you are a bachelor." "I like brunettes," he said weakly. "So I see," she said. "Is it supposed to rise again so fast?" Mortified, Lubos moved his hands to cover himself again. "Get dressed while I take these outside to dry." She gathered up his wet clothes. "They are much finer than the ones you wore yesterday. You should have corrected me when I called you a farm laborer. Or at the very least introduced yourself." I was... He couldn't seem to finish his sentences around her. "Struck dumb also, you said?" "Yes. Get dressed. Though not as fine as your own garments, these things should at least fit. If anyone in the village were to hear I'd been alone with a nude man on a mission from the king, all the old ladies would die of shock." She swept out of the room. Lubos slumped. Thrice he'd made a fool of himself. He'd never be able to look her in the eye again. Let alone her husband. When he'd managed to cover himself up enough to satisfy even the most modest old woman from the village, Lubos crept down the stairs, wondering if he could escape without anyone seeing him. He'd trade his own clothes for these happily if it meant not seeing. "Ah, good, they fit. I was worried you might be too big for them," Raidmaker said. "One of the village boys just told me about another hive swarming, that I hope to catch. Molina can show you around the mill. No one knows the workings of this place better than she does." He stuck a hat on his head and departed, leaving Lubos to stand with his mouth agape in the dining hall. "So, are you truly interested in the mill, or are you and my father cooking up some sort of scheme together?" Molina asked, appearing in the doorway. "I've never met your father," Lubos protested. Molina laughed. "You're a strange one, Master Lubos. You were just talking to him a moment ago. Remember, the miller?" It took a moment for the gears in Lubos' head to mesh together. "Raidmaker, the miller, is your father? You don't see the family resemblance? I know I look a lot like my mother." "Ah, but you know that already." Lubos felt himself reddening again. "I thought you were his wife. The one who designed the water wheels." "No, that was definitely my mother. Her mother designed the first one, but it was Mother who replaced it with something much more suitable. I've improved on them a little, but there's little I can do there. It's the potential of what we can do with them that I want to work with. But Lord Barkmeyer won't hear a word of it." "Lord Barkmeyer said he wanted to marry you." Lubos wasn't sure why he said it, but he did recognize the wave of jealousy rising up at the thought. "Do you think me a fool for refusing?" Her dark eyes seemed to see right through him. It should have made him feel uncomfortable, but Lubos raised his own eyes to meet her gaze. "No. He doesn't deserve a woman like you." "Meaning he deserves better?" "Oh, you do have a way with words, Master Lubos. No wonder you're still a bachelor." She walked out. "No, wait." Lubos followed her and seized her shoulder. "Please, Mistress Molina. That is not what I meant. Barkmeyer is a fool with a head as empty as his daughter's. A woman like you would be wasted on the likes of him." Molina glanced at his hand but did not shrug out of his grasp. "For once we agree. Tell me something, as you seem to have untied your tongue. Did you really come here to see the mill? Do you really want the tour my father is so set that I take you on?" Lubos swallowed. "I came here to see you and return the drawing you left up at the pools yesterday. I want to see anything you're willing to show me. I know I've been a fool, but I wish to show you I am not as much of a fool as Barkmeyer. If these water wheels are truly as useful as you say, then I must tell the king about them." "Good. Then I'll take you on a tour. My father thought I would have to seduce you and make you marry me before you'd agree to take word of these water wheels to the capital." Lubos froze, entranced at the thought of her seducing him. He wanted nothing more. But she was already striding away toward the spinning water wheels, and he had to run to catch up. He didn't intend to lose her this time. 12. A man who blushed. The sensible part of Molina's brain told her to run far and fast from this man, for she had no patience for fools. But the other part of her mind, the louder part, reminded her that everybody did foolish things on occasion. The village boys in particular, when courting a girl they fancied. Not that Lubos could fancy her after such a short time. Then again, she knew he fancied taking her to bed. She wondered if his being a bigger man would make such a thing better or worse. Not that she intended to try him out just to sate her curiosity. Then who would be the foolish one? Molina explained how the water wheels worked, then pointed out the improvements she'd made. They might be small, but they were nevertheless important changes that her mother would surely have made herself in time. "And what of the machine you sketched yesterday?" Lubos asked, holding out the damp bark piece that had survived his dunking. Molina took the drawing and stared at it for a long moment. An idea that came to me yesterday. A wheel for spinning thread. By making the spinning go faster, a woman could spin more in a day, or have more time for other things. Or if every woman in town had one and spent the same amount of time spinning, there'd be more linen than they could possibly need. Enough to sell, for there is always a market for linen, whether 'tis coarse or fine. Or if I could harness a water wheel to power the spinning wheel, or a dozen spinning wheels, much like I've done with the hammers for beating the flax into fibers we can spin. Only now did she recognize the glazed-over look in Lubos' eyes, and stopped. Maybe he wasn't so different to the village boys or Barkmeyer after all. I can see I'm boring you, Master Lubos. He shook his head and the glazed look vanished. No, you are distracting me. I should be listening to your words, but you're filled with such passion that my thoughts drifted elsewhere. I must apologize, Mistress Molina. No matter how intently I listen to your words, I will never be able to convey them as clearly as you can. Your ideas are amazing. They cannot be allowed to rot in this place, like flax in the millponds. They must be conveyed to the king while they are still fresh and new. When I leave for the capital, you must come with me. Leave the village and visit the capital? Molina's heart leaped at the thought. No one left the village, and if they did, it was only to visit the next town over. The capital. Why, it was as distant as the moon to most of them. To think she might get to meet the king and have one of the king's own men speaking in support of her. Perhaps her spinning wheels could be more than just a dream. She seized Lubos's shoulders and kissed him. She intended it to be a chaste kiss, she knew her father was watching after all, but the moment her lips touched his, she forgot everything. His lips were warm and willing, parting to tempt her inside, and she could not refuse. His tongue caressed hers with an ardor that spoke of more, far more than a simple kiss. And as she kissed him back, letting her tongue dance with his, her body ached to share that ardor, pressing against him so that she could feel the heat of him through his borrowed clothes. What would it feel like to have his hands stroke her the way he'd stroked himself, crying out her name as he touched her? Molina pushed him away before she tore his clothes off in her passion to satisfy her curiosity. Molina took a deep breath. I will come with you, she said, then added, if my father agrees he can spare me. She nodded up the mountain, to the trees where she suspected her father watched, unseen, waiting for just such a kiss. She was not surprised when the question was put to her father, that he sat there as satisfied as a cream-filled cat as he gave his permission. But you must swear to take good care of her, for Molina is my only daughter and very precious to me, father finished. Lubos looked grave, then placed his hand over his heart. Sir, I swear to you on my honor that I will hold her life dearer than my own for every moment she is in my care. Neither made any mention of her returning home, Molina noticed, but chose to hold her tongue. Father imagined her marrying the man, she was sure of it, but Lubos. She wasn't sure why he would want to keep her. Perhaps to supervise the wheel building or some such thing. For a man who could resist Barkmeyer's daughters was not one who allowed his passions to rule him. She pushed away the small voice in her head that protested about how little she knew about this man, or the king and his court. This was her fate, and she would not let such an opportunity pass by without seizing it. No one could know the future, but she knew hers was twisted up with Lubos, at least for now. And on the journey she would have time to find out if he truly was a fool, or merely a fool in love. Was it too much to ask that her heart longed for the second? 13. It took every ounce of Abraham's will not to take Major in her arms and kiss her like he wanted to. If he failed, he would never see her again. Never touch her. He dropped to one knee. My lady, I swear on my life that I will not return until the curse is broken. She reached for his face, but he reared back before she could touch his skin. He could not risk her falling victim to his curse. Tears coursed down her cheeks. You don't know he has it. You don't. Stay until the babe is born. Then, if he is cursed, as you say, you can go and seek out this witch in the capital. Please, Abraham." He shook his head. "You do not understand. The curse will not show until he is close to the end of his life, and then it will be too late. For him. For me. I must find this witch in the capital, for she is in danger," the seer said, "and only she can break the curse. I swore an oath to my father on his deathbed. An oath I cannot break." "What about your oath to love and protect me?" He met her anguished eyes, and it felt like his heart had been replaced with her own, for anguish squeezed his just the same. But he could not yield. So he swallowed and said, "This is the only way I can protect you and the child you carry. As long as I am near you, one touch could kill you. I cannot let that happen. Farewell, Major." He turned, hardening his heart against the heartbroken sobbing behind him, and strode out to his waiting horse. "You're a fool," Chase said, emerging from the shadows outside the gate. Abraham sighed. "That I am. If I could have spared her this, I would have. Now I will do all I can to save our son from the curse." He swallowed, wincing as his chest ached again. "Take care of her for me, brother." "I am her brother, not yours. And a fool too for not protecting her from you." "Then I am honored to have been able to call you brother, if only for a short time," Abraham said. For in his heart, he knew he would never see Chase or Major again. Though he would have given everything he owned to be wrong. With a heavy heart, he spurred his horse into a gallop, leaving behind his home and everything he held dear. 14. For the first few days, Molina and Lubos rode together on the same palfrey, sometimes with her before him and sometimes behind. They made slow progress, for he stopped often to relieve himself, or so he said. More than once, she'd had to wait for him for some time while he disappeared into the woods, and she grew suspicious, for he drank no more than she did. On the third morning he procured a second palfrey from the inn, which he insisted was her new mount, and she was so busy managing the fine-looking but ill-tempered horse she paid little attention to what Lubos did, though it seemed to her he stopped less frequently. The evenings did not change though. Especially the ones they spent in the woods between inns. At least, not until they traveled further north, where the nights were colder. One such night she woke up, shivering, despite her heavy cloak and the merrily burning fire. "Is it always so cold, Master Lubos?" she asked through chattering teeth. "Yes," he said gravely. "I must find you a fur cloak before winter, for you will need it in the capital. In the meantime you may share mine." He flipped open his fur-lined cloak in invitation. Molina hesitated for only a moment, before she accepted. Rolled up in her own cloak, she was soon enveloped in his too. Close enough to kiss him, yet separated by enough layers of linen and wool to ensure propriety. Each night in the open, it became an oft-repeated routine. He would vanish into the woods for a little while, then return and offer to share his cloak with her. More than one morning she'd woken in his arms, with her head resting on his shoulder or his chest. Neither of them spoke of it, but it seemed like a small enough thing, so Molina didn't mind if he didn't. One night, when Lubos took his usual walk into the woods, Molina thought she heard him call her name. Then again, with considerable urgency. She hurried after him, determined to help him if he needed her. But she found he did not need her help at all, for it was as though they were back in her father's house, with him holding his manhood in both hands as he said her name over and over. This was what he did every night, and every morning too, Molina realized. So she wasn't the only one having carnal thoughts when they lay together at night. "Do all men exercise their manhoods as often as you do?" Molina burst out, unable to restrain her curiosity anymore. "Or is it because yours is bigger that it requires more exercise than most?" Lubos turned and stared at her, his face reddening. Had he truly thought she didn't know what he was doing? "I mean, every night and again every morning seems a little excessive." Most of the men in the village only do it once a night, which is once more than their wives would like, or so they say. Yet here you are, at it again. I can't stop thinking about you. Even in my dreams. This helps." He turned away and resumed stroking himself. The idea came again, the one that she couldn't stop thinking about, and this time Molina didn't dismiss it. Instead she said, "What would you be willing to give me if I helped you?" She almost laughed at her own awkward words. How her father believed she could seduce anyone, she didn't know. But she could not forget that kiss, or the thoughts that had come after. Helped me how? She gritted her teeth. She'd have to say it now. If I were to lift my skirts, perch on your lap, and let you put that snake of yours inside me. He let out a shaky breath. I'd give everything I have. My heart, my love, my protection for as long as I live. I'd marry you, make you my bride, and love you all the days of my life. But I'd want you more than just once, Molina. I'd want you always. Always, as he loved her all the days of his life. Some sort of madness descended on her, or perhaps it was sanity. She wasn't sure. But Molina marched up to Lubos and straddled him, lifting her skirts so she could feel his skin against hers. She looked deep into his eyes. "Swear it," she said. He groaned. "Oh Molina, I'd make you my wife before I dared do this. Yes, I swear by my life and yours and all I hold dear. I will marry you if you are willing." "Good," she said, then pushed against him, feeling the heat of him as he entered her. He cupped her bottom and drove deep, and she gasped. This was nothing like the one quick fumble she'd had with Rickard. Not painful at all. This was wonderful. "I'll marry you on one condition," she said breathlessly. "Name it," he panted. "You must make love to me every night. Just like this." He laughed. "It shall be as my lady wishes. Every night." Her pleasure built until she could no longer control it. She cried out, clenching down hard on him. The other girls in the village had never told her about this. Maybe this was the courtly love the wandering minstrels sang about, known only to men at court. "I love you, Lubos," she said. "And I love you, sweet Molina. I've never seen you more beautiful than you are tonight. I would give anything to hear you scream my name like that again." The way he moved within her, his soft kisses on her breasts and her face, his arms holding her tight, it was only a matter of time before she granted his wish, screaming his name into the night as she felt his own blissful release deep inside her. And for the first time in her life, she was content. 15. 3 times he made love to her that first night, and again in the morning. If he'd thought her passion for machines was bewitching, it was nothing compared to the unrestrained joy on her face as he brought her to the peak of her pleasure. Even in his dreams, he hadn't imagined coupling with her could be this good. And now, he couldn't imagine ever loving another woman the way he loved her. Watching her climb astride her mare shot a pang of jealousy through his heart. He wished he hadn't bought her the horse, so that she might ride before him again, pressed against his groin as she drove him to distraction. For tonight they would spend the night in a fine inn, where they would share the inn's biggest bed, and he could show her how much better be performed in a bed instead of the cold, hard ground. He'd make sure the room had a good fire, so that he could lay her naked upon the bed, and take his time learning every inch of the lovely body he'd touched in the dark last night. They made good time, perhaps because he'd set a faster pace in his eagerness to arrive at their destination. It was barely mid-afternoon. Perhaps he could persuade her to retire early. He glanced back at Molina, just in time to see her almost fall out of her saddle. She was so tired. Lubos raced to her side, ready to catch her as she half slid, half fell off the horse into his arms. "Innkeep your best room," Lubos shouted. The innkeeper himself came running out wide-eyed. He recognized Lubos on sight. Of course. And for the woman? She was more than just some woman. Molina would one day be his queen. Your best is for Lady Molina, my bride. We have ridden hard for some weeks now, and I fear it is more than she is accustomed to. A warm fire, water to wash with, a good meal and plenty of rest is what she needs. The innkeeper bowed low. Of course. One of my manservants will take her for you, and the grooms will see to your horses. Your father has sent. No one touches her but me, Lubos growled, surprising himself but not as much as the innkeeper, whose eyes were now wide as saucers. As you wish, your highness. But your father sent an urgent missive for you, and I dare not disobey the king, whose messenger said I must give it into your hands the moment I saw you. When my bride is safe and warm I will come down and see to this missive, Lubos said, already ascending the stairs with Molina in his arms. He laid her on the bed, then knelt to remove her boots. She had the tiniest feet, how had he not noticed before? He pulled off her stockings, remembering the feel of that fine linen against his back as she wrapped her legs around him. Lubos? Her voice was sleepy and slurred. He'd kept her up half the night, not letting her sleep at all. And here he was, wanting to interrupt her sleep again with more lovemaking. Lubos cursed himself. He'd have her for the rest of their lives, he could certainly wait an hour or two until she was rested. Rest, my lady. We're at an inn. I will make sure no one disturbs you, he said. She sat up, blinking. An inn? Is there water I can wash with? As if on cue, a maid knocked on the open door and entered, staggering under the weight of 2 full jugs of water. She was followed by 2 more girls, each as heavily laden, and a third carrying a wooden tub. The thought of Molina bathing naked stopped him in his tracks. He should dismiss the maids and offer to help her himself. Then afterwards perhaps. Sir, I was charged to remind you about the letter from the king, one of the maids said, dragging him out of much pleasanter thoughts. Reluctantly, Lubos nodded. Duty must come first. He followed the girls down the stairs, leaving Molina alone in her chamber. His father's missive had been long and suspicious, demanding answers about the various barons Lubos had visited, between lengthy rants about the infractions of each baron or sometimes even the present baron's ancestors, for father was a firm believer in bloodlines breeding true to the source. No matter how many times Lubos told him his son was not merely a younger copy of himself. Sighing, Lubos had called for parchment and ink and sat down to write the lengthy reply his father required, for it would be some weeks before they arrived in the capital, and father needed to know his barons were doing their best to recover from the spring floods, as opposed to cheating him of his tithes this year. Darkness had fallen by the time he was done, and he trudged up the stairs behind a maid bearing their dinner on a tray. She placed it on the table, dropped a curtsy, and left, closing the door behind her. Molina was asleep, cocooned in the bed like she'd lain in her cloak beside the fire those first few nights, before he'd made his thoughtless offer to share his cloak with her. She'd chosen to unwittingly torture him by accepting. All those nights laying beside her and not laying a finger on her until last night, and now he would share her bed. Dinner could wait, for Lubos could wait no longer. He shucked off his clothes and crawled into bed beside her. She'd bathed and dressed in a thin shift, so she now smelled faintly of soap and whatever herbs and flowers she kept her linens in. And she was warm from the combination of the merry blaze and the thick eiderdown that covered her. Almost as warm as she'd been last night. Lubos reached down, edging up the hem of her shift so that he could stroke her thigh. Her skin was as soft as the silks he'd dress her in, once he got her to the capital. He slid a finger inside her, gasping as he found her as hot and wet as when he'd surrendered to her last night. She moaned in her sleep. Lubos. He wanted to hear her scream his name again. He slid a second finger into her, stroking in and out, before pressing his thumb against that tiny little nub that was the center of her pleasure. She bucked, moaning louder this time, which only made him stroke harder. Her muscles clenched around his fingers, holding him inside her as Lubos circled her with his thumb. Her eyes flew open as her back arched up. "Oh my God, Lubos," she cried out. He withdrew his drenched fingers, then impulsively stuck them in his mouth, to see if she tasted as sweet as she looked. She was both sweet and salty, and he wanted more. He spread her legs wide, hissing his way up her thigh before plunging his tongue deep inside her. God, she tasted good. He slid his fingers inside her again, sucking hard at that little nub of hers until she gasped with delight. Slowly he took up the same rhythm as before, slower, more sensuously this time, as he relished the taste of her. Then she thrust her hips toward him, much like he'd thrust deep into her last night. "Lubos, please," she begged, tangling her fingers in his hair, throwing her legs over his shoulders to give him better access to all of her. "Oh, please." She came with a scream, her back arching so far off the bed only her head touched it anymore. Before she could come down of her own accord, he seized her around the waist, easing her onto his rock-hard cock. Her heels dug into his back as he drove deeper inside her than he'd ever been before. He filled her completely, his balls resting against her as if clamoring for entry too. She felt so good, he hoped he wasn't hurting her. He risked a glance at her face. Her eyes met his. "More," she demanded, clenching down on his cock. He pressed his thumb against her little nub, hearing her gasp as he slid almost out of her and then right back in, where he belonged. "Be careful what you wish for, my lady," he whispered, keeping his thrust slow and steady and powerfully deep, until his circling thumb unraveled her once more. He silenced her scream with a kiss and threw caution to the winds. "Slow and steady be damned." He pounded into her, egged on by her breathless commands for more until she clenched around him one more time, crying out his name over and over, and he was undone. When Lubos managed to open his eyes again, Molina, the most magnificent woman he'd ever met, eased her legs down from his shoulders to wrap them even more firmly around his waist, holding him deep inside her. "I am not ready to do that again, my lady. We men do not have the stamina of a lady like you," Lubos apologized. Molina gave a slight smile. "Perhaps not, but when you are ready, I will be the first to know." And she clenched deliciously around him, making Lubos wish he was ready now. Some hours later, he awoke to find her sitting astride him, rocking her hips gently as she rubbed against his once more hard cock. Like a dream made real. One who would one day be his wife. "I want more," she whispered. Lubos seized her hips, chuckling as she gasped in surprise and thrust home. 16. Every night and every blissful morning, Molina had to pry her body from Lubos. If she didn't, then she would neither sleep nor leave their shared bed, though it was becoming increasingly hard to remember why she wanted to. But today, Lubos had assured her they would reach the capital, and she did want to do that. She poured through her clothes, wanting something clean, but she'd worn all of them on this long trip. The only item that had stayed in her bag was her red petticoat, for her moonblood had not come this month. That meant she carried Lubos' child already. Good. Once they were married, they would be a family all the sooner. So much for the village boys' taunts that she was so thin she must be barren. Or a witch, as though her skills with the water wheels were some kind of magic and not simply something that came naturally to her mind. Lubos wanted water wheels and whatever she wanted to show him. And her. Oh, how he wanted her. Even this morning his loving smile melted something inside her. "Come back to bed," he said. She shook her head. "We enter the capital today. I want to wear my best, but everything is so travel-worn I fear I shall look like your poor country cousin." He rose and kissed her. "You will look beautiful as always, no matter what you wear. And you shall have all new clothes in the latest court fashions, if that is your wish. Nothing is too good for my lovely wife." "When will we be married? Will there be enough time to have a new gown made, or to launder these?" Molina asked. "You shall name the day. I must report to the king first, but after that my time is yours." As I am yours." She melted into his arms, wishing her worries would melt just as easily. Every inn they stopped at, he proudly introduced her as his new bride, and Molina wanted to believe him with all her might. But her mind would not stop spinning with all the things that could possibly go wrong. 17. "I should change my gown before I see the king," Molina said, hanging back even as Lubos seized her hand to lead her into the throne room. Lubos shook his head. "It's best not to delay when reporting to the king. He is very insistent about being the first to know any news. And he will not notice your gown, I promise you. Why, I can't tell if it's the same gown you wore yesterday, or if it is a new one. The only thing he would notice about your gown is if you weren't wearing one, because no man is immune to your beauty." Molina blushed. "You should not say such things. I'm sure if I had any beauty to boast of, someone in my village would have noticed and told me of it. And he will notice this gown, I am sure of it, for I left half of the skirt in a bramble hedge beside the road when that hateful horse decided to scratch her flank against it. Why, it is nothing but ribbons all down one side." When she held it out, Lubos realized the gown was quite ruined, but the layer of cloth beneath seemed unharmed, as were her stockings. Her modesty would be preserved. "I didn't notice until you told me. I'm sure he won't, either. Here, I shall walk on that side of you as we enter the throne room, and it will be quite invisible." Before she could object again, Lubos linked his arm through hers and marched into the throne room. Courtiers passed to let them through, bowing as they recognized him. Lubos wanted to point out to Molina that nobody noticed a little dust from the road, that they saw him for who he was, and it would be the same for her, but he kept his observations for later. The sooner this audience was over, the better. He stopped at the foot of the dais and bowed low. "Father, you will not believe what I found in Lord Berkmeyer's barony. The skinniest, ugliest whore in the kingdom?" Lubos heard Molina's gasp as her hand slipped from his grasp. Father didn't seem to have noticed. Berkmeyer said he had the most beautiful daughters in the country. Plump, fair and fertile, just what any man would want in a wife. If that beanpole is one of his, then what else has he lied about? Lubos rose. "Father, this is Lady Molina, and she is most certainly not one of Berkmeyer's daughters, though the man wanted to marry her himself. She works miracles. The things she can do with water wheels and a wheel for spinning thread. Why, if we equipped every mill in the country with one of her wheels, the treasury would be full of gold within the year. Never have I seen anything like it. Machines that can do the work of 3 men, using the water from the river. If you let me show you." The king waved his hand languidly. "I have no desire to see what some slovenly stable girl can do. I'm sure she has spread her legs and her lies far enough for you to have been ensnared by her. Has she fucked away your wits too, so that I will need to name your brother Zylander the crown prince instead of you?" Lubos didn't dare look at Molina. All he knew was he had to get her out of there. "Your Majesty will choose his successor wisely, I am certain," Lubos said evenly. "Just as you have chosen your loyal barons and lords wisely, for they have striven mightily to provide you with a tithe even in these times of hardship and floods, which took most of their harvests. As you will have already seen in the reports I sent back while I was traveling. And as you were kind enough to bring up the subject of marriage, I would very much like to discuss my marriage with you, though perhaps in the privacy of your apartments." He glanced pointedly at the packed court behind him. "There is nothing to discuss. As long as she is female and fertile and of a rank befitting your station, and she comes with a sizable dowry in gold, you may bed whatever bitch you please. When the sow is pregnant, then you may go back to tumbling stable girls." Father made a shooing motion with his hands. "Get this slut out of my sight." Lubos muttered something he hoped sounded obedient and suitably contrite, before hustling Molina out. He almost had to carry her, for her feet didn't seem to want to work until the throne room door had closed behind them. "I must apologize for my father. His mind is not as sharp as it was, Lubos began, but Molina didn't seem to hear him. He'd been such a fool. Gently, he took her hand and guided her to his chambers, where he could apologize to her properly without half the court hearing. 18. Molina's mind whirled worse than ever. Lubos was the crown prince. His father, the king, wanted nothing to do with waterwheels and wouldn't let them marry, for he thought she was unworthy of his princely son. Far from home carrying Lubos' child, what was she to do? She followed Lubos through the castle, as lost in her own thoughts as in the maze of stone halls. Lubos opened another door and gestured for her to go through. When Molina did, she found herself in a tower room, instead of another passage. A bedchamber, if she didn't miss her guess, full of the sort of rich furnishings she would expect to belong to royalty. Not at all suitable for what had the king called her? Oh yes, the slovenly stable girl who had spread her legs and her lies for the prince. Lovely. Barkmeyer's snide comments about her sanity seemed almost like compliments in comparison. I'll have some water sent up, and a maid with fresh clothes, who will see that yours are laundered. I'll have some dinner sent up too, for my father's great hall is not the place for you yet, I think. Not until we are wed, Lubos said. Molina laid a hand on his arm. When we are wed? Why did you not hear the king? He said he would never allow us to wed. Lubos, your highness, I cannot allow you to commit treason. You cannot lose your head for me. And she would lose hers too, she thought, but didn't say. Lubos grimaced. My father is old and prone to rash decisions like today, but in time I have found he will eventually see reason. So he will over our marriage. He sent me out to find gold from his vassals and a bride. He made no mention of wealth or dowries then, and once his ire has cooled, I will explain to him the value of your waterwheels. Then he will demand we marry, and we will. Until then, remain here in my quarters as much as possible, except when you are working with the castle carpenter. Or is it the Wainwright you need? Whoever and whatever you need, you shall have it, so that when my father wishes to speak to you again, you will have not just a picture but a real moving device to show him. Against her better judgment, hope kindled in Molina's breast. These are your quarters? Yes, and they will be yours too. As my bride-to-be, you will be showed all the respect befitting a princess. New gowns, new shoes, a new spinning wheel, all that you ask for will be yours. Even me, for I made a vow I intend to keep. He pulled her into his arms and kissed the top of her head. Please be patient just a little while, my love, and everything will be as it should be. I promise. He pulled away and bowed to her. A maid, water, dinner, I shall have it all sent up to you on my way to see the carpenter. Then I will return to share the meal with you, before we retire to bed for the night. If that meets with your approval, my lady? Now who was struck dumb? The irony wasn't lost on her. Yes, she said finally. Your Highness, she added. He waved the words away. There are no titles between us. You are my lady and my equal. In my mind, you are already my bride. Anything else is just mere words and ceremony. I am yours. Never doubt that. Then he whirled on his heel and was gone. Molina sat on the enormous bed, big enough for Lubos and all four of Barkmeyer's daughters if he'd chosen all of the girls instead of just her, and tried to calm her thoughts. With all her heart, she wanted to believe Lubos. She placed a hand on her belly. For the future of the child inside her, she had to hope what he said was true. In the meantime, she would work with this carpenter and do everything Lubos said. For this court was a strange place to her, as alien as the surface of the moon, and one wrong step would see her lose not just her own life but her child's life too. Molina swore it would not come to that. 19. Lubos found Zimmerman in his workshop outside the castle gates. He watched the carpenter hammering what looked like a chair, before Zimmerman noticed him. Down went the hammer and Zimmerman bowed. "Your Highness." "An honor." It hadn't always been an honor. Zimmerman had often chased Lubos and the Castellan's boys out of his workshop when they came searching for wood to make into toy boats to sail on the moat. Lubos grinned. "Do you have any spare bits for boats, Master Zimmerman?" Zimmerman's mouth dropped open. "I'd forgotten about you boys and those boats. It seems like so long ago, but your Highness has only to ask, and I will make whatever you wish. Though if it's boats you're after, might I suggest Bootsma, the royal boat builder instead? As I'm sure you and your friends found out all too quickly, my fresh planks are more likely to sink than float." "It's not for me, my friend. I need your skills for my fiancée, the amazing woman I'll soon marry. She has the most inventive mind, contraptions that could do the work of a man or a woman or even a whole village. Using wheels and water and all manner of things. Truly remarkable. What Lady Molina designs, I want you to build for her. I need you to bring her drawings to life, so that my father can truly appreciate them." Zimmerman sucked in a breath. "So the rumors are true. People have been spreading stories that you'd found a bride somewhere in the provinces, and you were bringing her home. Some even said she had the next heir on the way." Molina carrying his child? He couldn't imagine a happier thought. Well, they'd certainly made love enough times on the journey for such a thing to happen, though it was probably too early to know. "She is like no other woman I've ever met. A treasure who will one day be queen. In the meantime, I'm sure she will keep you and every other carpenter in the kingdom busy improving the place. Now would be a good time to take on an apprentice or two." Zimmerman bowed. "It will be an honor to work for the future queen. Something to tell my grandkids, if my daughters ever get around to having any." "That it will be," Lubos promised him before heading back into the castle. He found his father in his private chambers, dressing for dinner as usual at this time of day. "What do you want?" Father demanded. "Come to tell me you've gone and married the stable girl against my wishes, so I'll have to cut off her head? Don't test me, boy, I'll do it no matter how pretty she is. Our treasury needs gold, not girls." "I'll bring you the gold you ask for, father, you'll see. Many of the provinces were hard hit by the spring floods, and they have little to spare. But what I discovered out there, you should have seen it, father. They were using the floodwaters to power the mill wheels and to make linen and all manner of things. Almost miraculous. I'll ask Zimmerman to put together some models so that you can see these things in action. I'm sure you'll see how useful they will be. For while a machine mills the grain, the men can plant another crop. Triple the size of the usual flax crop, ready to spin into linen thread in half the time it normally takes." Lubos almost added that it was all thanks to Molina, but held his tongue. When his father saw the models and truly appreciated their value, then he would tell the king that she alone was responsible for them. Father squinted at him. "I thought you said the girl made them." "She designs them. A skilled carpenter has to make them," Lubos said. Actually, he wouldn't put it past Molina to have done the work herself back at home. But she had no need for such things here. Providing for her was his job now. "I will see the models when you have them. Until then, where are my tithe collectors with my gold? Aren't you supposed to be with them?" Lubos sighed. His father forgot far too much these days. "Molina and I rode ahead to bring you the news. I will return to the cart train on the morrow, to see if I can hurry them along." Not likely, but it was what his father wanted to hear. "Good. Can't leave you a penniless kingdom when my reign is over, can I? What kind of king would that make me?" Lubos made suitably sympathetic noises, but inside, his resolve was as hard as iron. With or without his father's help, he and Molina would work to make their kingdom great again. As husband and wife. 20. Abraham reined in his horse just before the bridge. With all the traffic headed into the city, including an endless train of carts that looked to be carrying either the king's tithe or enough food to feed an army, he hadn't been moving faster than a walk anyway, but now he had to stop, for the very tower the witch had spoken about loomed above him. The windows were unshuttered in the warm summer air, and Abraham fancied he could see a shape looking out through one. A feminine silhouette there for a moment, before it was gone. A maiden locked in the tower, perhaps? One who would be so grateful to him for rescuing her that she would break the curse as a matter of course? It would not be easy getting in, for the tower was part of the castle, but that was where his magic shoes would come in. He would sneak in, carry the girl out, persuade her to break the curse, and be home with Major before the baby was born. He would hold his son in his arms, free of the curse that had plagued their bloodline for far too long, or he would not be able to look his son in the eye, for he would be a failure of a father. Abraham urged his horse across the bridge, his eyes fixed on the tower. Therein lay his salvation, and he would not let it slip from his grasp. 21. Molina rose and peered out the window. Ever since the morning Lubos left, she'd been watching for him. While she worked with Zimmerman, she'd managed to put him out of her mind for an hour or two at a time, but now she had the thread-spinning wheel and spindle arrangement before her, she was terrified to try it. What if it worked? What if it didn't? This was sleeker, more polished than the simple device she'd imagined, but then she hadn't expected to have the services of a royal carpenter who made ornate carved chairs for his living. She squinted at a horseman on the bridge, but he didn't look like Lubos. She'd ridden beside Lubos enough to recognize him on sight. Yet the carts coming through the gate were more numerous than usual, so they had to be the tithe. Where was Lubos then? Perhaps he was even now on his way up to the tower to surprise her. She turned away from the window, smiling. She could surprise him too. The baby was a visible bump between her hips now, and she had this table thing, which she had to test before he got here, for if it worked. She found some combed flax, as fluffy as fresh combed wool, and twisted a length of it into thread between her fingers, threading it on the spindle. When she'd secured it, she set the fluffy flax on the distaff, and gave the wheel a push with her elbow. The spindle spun and she soon had her hands full, keeping the wheel turning while she twisted the thread. If the wheel could be spun by water or even her foot, it would be much better, but she was slowly getting accustomed to this. The spindle was full almost before she realized it, and she fitted a second. This time she spun the wheel a little faster, for she had the timing of it, and the second spindle was full in no time. Why, she'd barely been working for a few minutes, and she'd done a whole morning's work. This would change everything. She wanted to shout and dance and sing, but she didn't dare do any of these things in the king's castle until Lubos returned, for he should be the first one to know. So she fitted her third and final spindle, and began to spin again. As if in answer to her wish, the door behind her swung open, and the footsteps that entered were too heavy to belong to anyone but a man. Lubos was home. "Come and see," she said. "It's even better than I imagined it could be." She didn't dare stop, for the thread would be uneven. A hand descended on her spindle, stopping it. "Lady, you need to stop playing with that toy. For what I have to say to you is a matter of life or death if you do not." He let go of her spindle, but it no longer moved, for he'd done something to the thread that turned it yellow. Molina stared up in horror, at a man who certainly wasn't Lubos. 22. The terrified girl seemed to banish her fear in a moment as she rose. "Who are you?" she demanded. She was a princess, the seer had said, which explained her regal bearing as well as her fine gown. Major had nothing half so fine. Abraham promised himself that when the curse was broken, he would find a fabric merchant to sell him some rich cloth to take home as a gift for Major. But first he had to persuade the girl to help him, and not betray him to the king. For the king would not look kindly upon an intruder in his castle, however loyal the house of Rumpelstiltskin might be. Who I am matters not, Abraham said finally. All that matters is you help me. She edged away from him toward the door. You should not be here. If you wish for someone's help, you should petition the king. Her hand closed on the door handle. No! Abraham shouted, lunging for her. She scrambled away, crossing the room so that the wheel table she had been playing with stood between them. If my husband returns and finds you here, he will cut you down. Leave while you still have legs to run with. For if you harm me, there is nowhere you can run to where he will not find you. Harm her? He had to save her. Abraham stared at her for a long moment before he could find the words he needed. I have not come here to hurt you, princess, he said slowly. I need your help, and I will pay handsomely for it. So handsomely you will never need to spin your own thread again. He reached for the spindles of spun thread he recognized, for Major had used similar ones, and closed his fingers around them. In a moment the common white thread turned to pure gold. He held out the transformed spindles. You see? What have you done? She demanded. I will make you richer than you have ever dreamed if only you help me, Abraham said. He thought he heard footsteps on the stairs. He would have to be quick. Come with me. I will tell you everything you need to know, and once you have helped me, I will fill your chamber with enough gold to last you a lifetime. I don't want gold or riches. I want my husband and no one else. Get out, she said fiercely. The footsteps were getting closer. Please, princess. Abraham pulled on his gloves and offered her his hand. All the wealth you could ever want, and all I ask is a night of your time. No. The door handle moved. Abraham was out of time. I shall return on the morrow and ask you again, he promised, before stamping his foot 3 times to conjure a hole large enough for him to escape through before the door opened. 23. Lubos wanted to skip all the way up to her chamber, as she'd named the empty room above his own that Molina had claimed for her workroom. He settled for racing up the steps, something he hadn't done since he was a boy. He threw open the door, and there she was. For a moment she seemed transfixed with shock, before her thunderous expression cleared and her beaming smile blinded him. Lubos! She dashed across the room and threw her arms around him, kissing him with such fervor he wished he'd thought to commission a bed for this chamber. He did not want to break the embrace, but he knew he would have to. His father expected him in the throne room, and he would have to explain his delay. Gently he pushed her away from him so that she stood at arm's length. I must report to the king, and I cannot take you with me. Not yet. One day, he promised himself. No, not yet. She wrapped her arms around herself and shivered, though the room was not cold. The king had that effect on many people, it seemed. Lubos cast around the room, and his gaze lit upon the wheeled table he'd seen in her drawings. Did Zimmerman manage to make one for you? Does it work? She smiled. It took several tries, but yes, he finished this for me today. I sat down to spin, and it seemed but a moment, yet I did a whole day's work in that time. I've never spun so much in my life. Spinning with a wheel is easily twice or thrice as fast as spinning by hand. Look how many spindles I filled. She waved a hand at the table and the pile of what Lubos had to assume were spindles. Lubos gathered them up, then kissed her quickly. I'll take these to my father and tell him you have a machine that can make miracles. I'm sure it will please him. I told you we will help him see reason. Before he could surrender to his desire for her again, he forced his feet to carry him out of her chamber. Once I have reported to the king, I am yours, my lady. I have a great number of kisses I mean to share with you in our bedchamber below, he called over his shoulder as he headed down the stairs. I will be waiting, he heard her say. Grinning, Lubos marched to the throne room only to find his father had dismissed the court for the day. Sighing, he headed back up a different set of stairs to his father's solar. He heard his father's muttering before he entered the room and strained his ears to hear the words. Something about demanding his son for marriage, when he'd offered his daughter. His father didn't sound likely to accept the proposal, whoever it was for, and Lubos breathed a sigh of relief. "Good evening, father," he said loudly as he entered the solar. No courtly bows were required here, for there was no audience to impress. "Is it?" Father eyed the window suspiciously. "Have you caught my thieving barons yet, boy?" Lubos shook his head. "No, not yet. They all seem to be a loyal lot. But I do bring good news. Lady Molina has perfected the miraculous spinning wheel she promised, and look what she has made." He set the 3 spindles on the table before his father. They didn't look particularly impressive. For a moment, Lubos wished he'd brought Molina and her spinning wheel along too, but then he remembered his father's tastes ran to women like Barkmeyer's daughters, not his lithe lady. Father picked one up and examined it, then took it to the window, where the sunlight might better illuminate Molina's work. "Who did this?" Father demanded. "Lady Molina, the lady I wish to marry," Lubos began. "How?" Father interrupted. "With a miraculous spinning wheel of her own design. She takes some combed flax, spins the wheel, twists the flax through her fingers, and turns it into that. Faster than you can believe," Lubos said proudly. "She shall show me on the morrow. If it is truly as you say, you must marry the girl. Marry her before someone else does." Lubos hardly dared believe his luck. "Marry her on the morrow? Father, thank you." Father glared at him. "I did not say that. Tomorrow she will prove her claims while you finish the quest one have twice sent you on but you have failed at. When you have found the barons cheating me of my share and restored their tithe to me, then you may marry her. Meantime I shall keep her close. She cannot be allowed to escape. Make sure you lock her in her chambers tonight." There would be no need to lock her in anywhere, Lubos thought but didn't say. He could happily keep Molina confined to the bed until the morrow, and she would be his willing prisoner. Especially when he told her he had his father's permission to marry on his return. He bade his father a good evening for the second time, and sped to the chamber where Molina waited for him. 24. The moment the bedchamber door closed behind him, Molina opened her mouth to share all her worries with Lubos, not least of all the strange man who'd stopped her spinning wheel, but Lubos pressed a finger to her lips. "I must leave in the morning to finish my quest for the king. The sooner I go, the sooner I may return and we can be married. I know you have much to tell me. I could tell you much about my travels too, but neither is important right now. We have one night together and I wish to spend it sharing as much love as possible, so that the memory will warm us both when we are far apart." He looked longingly into her eyes. "I will make love to you any way you wish from now until dawn, and I swear the next night we spend together shall be our wedding night. My father has agreed, and so it shall be." The very thought of him inside her once more kindled a fire within her brighter than she'd imagined possible. Why, it seemed her insides burned to feel him again. Lubos was right. She didn't want to waste these precious hours with words. She hitched up her skirt, layers of silk and linen, until she was bare to the waist but for her stockings. She hooked one leg around his hip, sliding her hand up under his tunic for his hard length. Her fingers tangled with his, intent on one purpose, uniting them. He thrust inside her, cupping her bottom as he lifted her, pushing deeper to her moaning satisfaction. "Oh God, Molina," he said as he backed her up against the wall. "So long I've been dreaming of you like this." She fastened her legs around his hips, holding his gaze as he filled her. "And are you? Make the first time hard and fast. If we have all night, we can take our time." He chuckled. "Hard and fast you shall have, but I think you have forgotten something. My lady must come first." He pinned her to the wall, as full of him as she was with child. Without taking his eyes off hers, his thumb found precisely the right spot at the apex of her thighs, rubbing hard and fast until her vision dissolved into stars. Only then did he move again, maintaining the same rhythm until they cried out for joy together. She was too busy gasping for breath to protest when he withdrew from her. But then he carried her to bed, and began to unlace her gown. He peeled away layers of fabric until he bared her breasts, which he covered with kisses. With her nipples already far too sensitive, thanks to her pregnancy, the moment he decided to suck on one was almost enough to send her over the edge, and she cried out. "Did I hurt you?" he asked immediately, pulling away. "No, of course not. Please don't stop," she said. He grinned and lowered his lips to her breast again. His hands dipped lower, bunching her skirts up until he bared her legs. Legs she parted willingly at a touch, for she knew the magic that dwelled in his fingers. Magic that soon made her cry out his name over and over until she was too hoarse to speak. Only then did he finish undressing her, dragging her skirts down and throwing them to the floor, heedless of what happened to them. When she wore nothing but her silken stockings, he paused. "Would you like me to take them off?" she asked, feeling incredibly self-conscious as his eyes devoured her otherwise naked body. "No. They stay," he said, sitting on the bed beside her. "Now come sit in my lap and help me take my clothes off." He didn't wait for a response, lifting her easily so that she sat astride him, just like on their very first time together. And he was rock hard between her thighs, ready for her. She reached down, ready to guide him inside her, but Lubos caught her hands and lifted them to the buttons at the front of his tunic. "I'll take care of that. You see to my clothes." Her hands shaking with anticipation, she worked at the fastenings on his tunic. Never had it taken her so long to free 3 buttons from their loops, and she almost cried when the third one finally came free. As if that was his cue, Lubos thrust into her partway, holding tight to her hips when she tried to squirm down the length of him to drive him deeper inside her. "My clothes," he reminded her. Reluctantly, she pulled his tunic up over his head. He slid in an inch deeper. She took a deep breath, tugging his undertunic off too. He filled her completely and she let out a sigh of pleasure. "Don't forget my hose," he said, grinning. Molina glanced over her shoulder. Sure enough, he wore thick woolen hose, the cloth scratchy beneath her bottom. Yes, they had to go. She managed to get them down past his knees by rising up onto her own knees, but in order to pull them off entirely, she'd need to lean right back. One glance at his grin told her he had no intention of helping. Wrapping her legs securely around his waist, she bent backward, arching her back up as she stretched her arms behind her to push his hose down his calves and off his feet. "My God, you're beautiful, Molina." His finger stroked the nipple of one upthrust breast. A delicious sensation that made her cry out again. "Here, I'll help you up." One strong hand splayed across her back, while his other fastened around her hip, crushing her against him. But instead of lifting her up, he fell back on the mattress, pulling her with him until she sat astride him while he lay supine on the bed. "If I had a choice, I would spend every moment of the rest of my life like this with you. Hard and deep inside you, while you ride me to the peak of your own pleasure, with your breasts bouncing just like that." With his hands on her hips, he lifted and lowered her, thrusting up to meet her until she caught his rhythm, leaving his hands free to caress her breasts until she screamed. But they didn't stop. Not until dawn stole him from her and she collapsed, empty and aching, in his lonely bed. For nothing was quite as heartbreaking as holding her husband-to-be and losing him, all in one night.